Welcome to Socializing Security, where every week we have a discussion about security, compliance, and beyond.
Our goal is to learn and grow by socializing each week's topic with each other, our guests, and with you.
A quick compliance note, this podcast is meant for informational purposes only and should not be considered legal or regulatory advice.
We're glad you've joined us, and we hope you'll learn along with us. Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of Socializing Security. We're glad to have you back, and glad to start in on something new this week, Milu.
I'm so excited. We're finally bringing on our first speaker, which will be so exciting. This is really the format that we're hoping to do for a lot of our episodes. So I'm really excited to bring on Tom. Do you want to introduce Tom?
Yeah. So Tom Hollingsworth is an old friend in the industry of mine that Milu just recently got to get to know. Anyone who has met Tom, I think, instantly likes Tom. He's really easy to get along with. But his time in the industry has been long, much like mine, and varied in a lot of different ways too. So was a long time networking person, CCIE and everything that you would expect a high quality seasoned network person to have, and became a bit of an influencer in the space. I got to know him through the VMware community. He later started becoming a part of the Tech Field Day events that Stephen Foskett first started putting on, and quickly kind of made his mark there to the point where Stephen ended up hiring him and making him a full-time event lead. So now Tom leads the networking and security focused events that Tech Field Day does. So we're going to talk with Tom about kind of the security Vendorscape and how you find vendors in the security space and influencers and where the trusted sources of information are out there.
Every company is different, right? Their approach of how they bring on a third-party vendor. And that's really whether you're outsourcing or really bringing in somebody new. There's so many different things to think about of when you're picking somebody. Who do you trust? What are they plugging into, right? Which systems are they going to get access to? How sensitive of information is it? So on the compliance side, there's so many different puzzle pieces, and it really comes down to who is it that you're working with, and also how do you verify that?
I was on the customer side for a long time and had to help pick products. We have this problem. We need to pick a product. So step one is what are the solutions out there? What are the products? What are the vendors that offer a solution to the problem that you have? Then you've got to go and research them and figure out how they work and try to cut through their marketing. And they all try to put on the prettiest face they can, but how does it really work on the backside? Are they a trusted partner? How do they deal with support? Things like that.
Yeah, it's so interesting as a consumer, right? Because, if I'm thinking about like how I pick a restaurant, right? I really only go off of like a lot of reviews and then like maybe the menu, the website, right? You're thinking of what are the touch points that we're all looking at, whether it's we're maybe relying on software, maybe we're using like Yelp or like TripAdvisor or, some other, Google reviews, whatever it is that you use your favorite platform to look at, let's say your new best restaurant that you're going to go try. There's so many things on the marketplace now as well, on the security side and IT as well, that's trying to do something similar to make it easier, because it's really hard to come up with legitimate ways to actually like vet companies because they're all so different. So in the compliance space, right, there's a lot of certifications and standards that certain companies might always look for. Like in the US, it could be like, do they have a SOC 2 report if that applies to their business? Do they have an ISO 27001 if it's information security related on more of a global spectrum? So there's so many different things, and every industry and company can be different. And so understanding what are the common questions, there's some commonality between all of them, right? Is like, do you have a website? Do you have maybe a privacy notice? There's a lot that are consistent. And I do think we're hoping to talk about some of that in our episode, but also just learning from like Tom's expertise and, his perspective and viewpoint on this.
Yeah. And I do highly respect Tom's perspective on things, because I have seen him as an influencer. I have seen him vet interesting companies to invite onto Tech Field Day to present and provide that message. I guess those that aren't familiar with Tech Field Day, maybe I should explain that a little bit. Mm-hmm. So Tech Field Day was started by a guy named Stephen Foskett. The idea there was to create a space where vendors and influencers could work together, to come together to tell the stories that those vendors have. And unlike in the influencer space for the consumer side of things, they wanted to make sure that there was that firewall in between them, so that you didn't have this concern of, oh, well, that person got paid by that vendor, or that person got free stuff from that vendor, so they're not going to do that. The idea that Tech Field Day has is that they will work with and contract with the vendors and take care of that, and then separately work with the influencers who don't get paid. They just get a expenses paid trip out to wherever they're doing Tech Field Day, or sometimes they do them virtual. And so Tom became an influencer within the space as a delegate initially, and then was later actually hired by the Tech Field Day team to be a event organizer. So he then leads the networking, wireless, and security field days specifically are the big ones that he leads.
Such incredible topics and things we would, I'm sure, love Tom's expertise on as we continue our journey here. But what a great initiative. And also, I think that was like a really helpful background just to like set the stage. I love the idea of taking out a little bit of the monetary portion of what's feeling sometimes like, can you trust an honest review if it's been paid for?
Tom brings us a great opportunity to not only talk about the vendor space itself and a lot of things you mentioned, but he also brings a lot of experience helping to understand who the right people are, whose voices really matter in the space. And I'm hoping that we can talk a bit about, how do you find people to trust?
Yeah, I love that. I mean, obviously, I'm a pretty big fangirl of the term trust, just it's kind of what compliance rebranded to. How do you establish trust with your audience, whomever that is? And how do you also find the right people to trust when you're building a business, when you're doing the work, when you're bringing in, you're outsourcing, who are you choosing? Like that conversation is so valuable. And I'm really looking forward to getting Tom's expertise on how he does this in his day-to-day with the work that he's doing at Tech Field Day and also in his other ventures. I think I'm excited to just get to know him a little bit better and also just hear his perspective on trust and how you do that with your vendors. Obviously, I've very much been enjoying the conversation that you and I have been having on our previous episodes, but I'm really looking forward to also just starting to expand our knowledge as well as our network of just learning. Like, Tom is one of your old friends and colleagues, but he's new to me in the sense that I'm very much looking forward to learning from him and from his background and experience. And I think we can all stand to learn together.
Tom, let's let everybody kind of hear your voice and know who you are if you want to do a quick intro for everybody.
I'm an event lead for Tech Field Day, so I spend a lot of my time talking to companies, and I spend a lot of time in the social space, being podcast guest. I host a weekly news show. We actually just got done recording it, and I was like, oh, look, security breaches again. So I spend a lot of time, learning about security and talking to people in the security space. So it's a fascinating way to be kind of on the cutting edge of things that are going on, but at the same time, continue to get that knowledge transfer because, this isn't, telco. Like we haven't solved all the problems yet.
One of the main things we want to cover off today is to really talk about the vendors in the space, as you do the quote unquote due diligence of trying to pick a security vendor, or really any vendor for that matter, because every product has a security spin on it. Some just do security in your environment, and some actually enable you to do security in your environment. And obviously you focus a lot on that latter one, but a lot of the due diligence type stuff, the investigatory pieces, will apply to any vendor. So as you look at the environments, as you look at who to bring on to Tech Field Day and have those discussions with the delegates, what are the things that you're looking for that say, hey, this company has something cool that we think the entire industry really might find a value?
The first thing we always look at is, what are you actually selling? What is the product? Because way too often, I always talk about, like, this is not too dissimilar from any other sales thing you've ever been into. If you don't know what you need when you go to like the used car lot or the store, you're not going to come back with what you need. You're going to come back with some kind of weird approximation of it. So I always kind of go in and when someone tries to give me the pitch, you want to call it that, my first response is always, okay, what are you selling? Are you selling a service? Are you selling a software platform? Are you selling hardware? Because that helps define what you're going to get out of this. Like, obviously, if you're selling hardware, I'm going to wind up with a box, and it's going to be a blinky box, and it's going to be a box that will probably eventually go out of date. So there's like a shelf life. If it's software, am I buying a subscription? Am I buying a one-off? If I'm buying a service, what happens when I stop using your service? Like these are the kinds of questions, because every answer leads to another like set of questions on the flow chart, right? And I feel like too many times people don't have that clearly defined when they start. It's like walking onto the car lot. And they're like, well, what do you want? I'm like, I want a car. All right, what are you going to do with it? How are you going to approach this? Where are you going? If you don't have that answer, you're not going to wind up with something that you're going to be happy with.
Do you find that software companies, like, how do they handle that question? Because I'm not sure if I've had a lot of like sales reps be super clear. Because when I'm vetting companies from the compliance perspective, it's very much like I'm like, okay, I'm very concerned about like what type of data, how is it going to integrate in systems, right? And again, asking the like, what is this thing is a super helpful startup, but I don't normally get the clearest responses from a lot of companies when I'm doing that type of analysis.
Oh, Malou, it's because they hate you, because you're asking that question instead of just accepting their marketing at face value. If you would just listen to what we're trying to convince you we do, then everything would be better, when in fact we all know that it's not. I always look at it, there's an old Henry Rollins skit on one of his spoken word CDs where he talks about going out on a date. And you're like, he's asking all these questions, and the responses that are like D4, C4, crap, you sunk my battleship. Like, when you counter their fluffy, exciting marketing pitch with concrete things, you get really down to the heart of the matter quickly. I do this a lot when I'm on briefing calls. I will often, like, when they give me their pitch, I will reframe it in my own words, but I will cut down to the quick really fast. They're like, oh, it's magical and revolutionary and all these other things. I'm like, you built another chat bot. Okay.
The buzzwords, they kill me. They kill me. I can't stand, there's certain buzzwords that when I'm working with like sales reps and stuff that I'm like, oh man, this is giving me like the ick. I don't know how to describe it in a better way, but there's just certain things that we have with like software companies, specifically in the technology industry, that like we're all using the same words that mean a lot of different things at the same time, because I think they're trying to be like, oh, well, we are flexible. But yeah, I like the question of what is the product? And if they can't give you a succinct answer, maybe that gives you a really good background of this company isn't really ready to tell you what their product is.
I always fall back on the maxim of, if you can't explain what you do to a 5-year-old, you don't know what you do.
I use it with I use the grandparent example. That's the one that I always say, that like if I can explain
direction.
what this is. Yeah. Same concept. Yeah.
Having been on both sides of that equation, actually 3 sides of that equation, as a marketing person, as a customer, and as a delegate or an influencer in the space, so much of that digging in and getting to the root of things can be difficult, especially in spaces that are new. So in the security space, what is XDR? Well, as a company that did XDR as a service, if you will, we had one definition, and vendor X had one, and vendor Y had another one. And it was, to me, as a person that had to go out and convince customers to consider us in that space, I felt it was really important. Like, I need to be able to explain what it is we're actually doing with this product and not rely on the buzzword. The buzzword's great for getting people to come to our site and say, oh, they've got a solution, let me look at it. But from there, it falls apart really, really fast. Because even as I consider from a competitive perspective, I'm like, oh my gosh, I can't just put a column that says XDR on there to say whether or not they do it. I need to know what they're doing so that I can then say whether we compare. So, that XDR column ends up becoming 15 different columns because there's 15 different things they could be doing in that space. And it's infuriating as a customer when I had to deal with that on that side.
I'm building a company at the moment, right? And I'm scaling as a founder, that now I'm realizing there's certain things that, even though I have like IT experience and security experience, there's certain things that I'm like, oh, I could own this, but I'm starting to figure out like, when should I outsource things, and like having that. And I would love to also just like hear your perspective on like, are there certain things that you would recommend certain companies should consider doing yourself, or should they be outsourcing? Should they be buying them? And when is like the decision for companies to like make those calls?
It's always a tough question, because as someone who is a founder of a company, you want to make sure that you're successful. That is bar none. At the end of the day, if you're not making money and you don't stay in business, then you are not successful as a company. But you also have to stop and ask yourself, what am I spending all of my time doing? This is the same question that people ask me when they're like, should I automate this task? Well, I don't know. Is it something that you do? Or is it something you do every day that takes too much of your time? And that's always going to come back to it. But for security, I would argue that it's not just something that you do that takes your time. It's what happens if it fails. Like if your password account recovery system stops working, is that going to significantly impact your people's ability to do their job? If the answer is yes, then that's something you need to do. Whereas, if it's like, I don't know, vetting a contractor to have access. Well, if it takes an extra day for them to get access, how much money are you really losing in the deal? And if that amount balances out with what you're paying the service to do it, so you don't have to spend your time doing it. Because that's the thing that a lot of people lose track of when they're making these business decisions, is they just assume, well, my time is free because I'm doing the work and I can just get it done. That's not true. Your time costs money. So, like, for example, people ask me all the time, why do you still mow your own yard? I'm like, because I find it relaxing. But when you look at how much money I technically cost when I'm doing that, I mean, yes, it would be cheaper to pay a kid to do it. However, I still feel that it's a valuable use of my time. Whereas, in a business sense, yeah, if this is a menial task that I would be better served giving to somebody else, then yes, pay them to do it.
That's a great analogy. It's one that I calculate in my head a lot too, as I still mow my yard and decide somebody could do it a lot better for probably cheaper per hour. So why am I still doing it? It's some ways it's my
Self-care.
weekly exercise. Yeah, it's my summertime exercise program. So I talked a little bit about using those buzzwords. Let's just call them what they are. Those buzzwords to generate traffic to the site, to say, hey, I have something here to provide you. You talk to a lot of startups, Tom, and of course the security space is just rife with startups these days because there are so many problems to solve. There's a lot of niche products that are coming in and saying, hey, we're gonna start something here. I inherited a product at my last job that was very niche, but they did an amazing job of what they were doing, but they were just so small, most people have never heard of them. How do you go about trying to find those types of vendors that are, have something solid, have something very useful, but just, may not be able to get the word out and be able to draw in the people that need to be there?
Well, there's two ways. The first way is to ask people like that are doing the work, the practitioners, what are you using? If somebody's using this corner case tool, okay, great. But if 15 people are using this corner case tool, now I've got something, because it wouldn't be recommended if it didn't work. The other way, honestly, is to go ask a company who they feel their competitors are. And you can automatically like discount some of the really large, like, tent pole kinds of companies, because everybody's going to say that they're their company. Don't look at who a company is punching up towards. Look who they are kind of in that same milieu with, or punching down toward, as the case may be. And the reason why is because the scrappy startups that are taking market share from the mid to larger companies are the ones that have the problem figured out. And it's funny when we talk to startups, because we have a problem in the security space that there's this tool mentality. I'm going to build a thing to do a thing, and that's it. And then you have the platform mentality of, but what if I could build an entire ecosystem around my tool to lock you into using it on a regular basis? I love tools. They don't always scale well, but it is what it is. Like, I don't need a Swiss Army knife sometimes. I just need a can opener. And if someone builds a really good can opener, then I want to tell people about that. Whereas it's the person who has like the folding multipliers with the LED flash drive thing on there. I'm like, you don't really understand your core audience when you build these things. And that's what happens when you get away from having engineers and practical talent building things, instead of, the investors said that we need to operationalize Gen AI reactivity, and already I've lost anybody who's going to deploy this thing.
I think that's such a great mindset of figuring out, ideally, when companies are trying to figure out their market fit, or they're trying to solve a problem, right? And they're building things, of making sure that they're being mindful of what do the customers actually want. And I think also asking them, what does the market want? And again, I think that's a lot of some of the work that you're doing at Tech Field Day too, is just like thinking through like how, like, what does the actual community think about these things? And can we actually get like some kind of unbiased reviews on these things, to just figuring out like, could people go try and use these things and actually give these companies feedback too? Because that's hugely valuable. And sometimes it's really hard for companies to just get that customer experience, like response of like, is this working? Or like, how can we change this to make it better?
It's hard, and I will be the first person to tell you that not everybody appreciates that. It's hard for you to invest a lot of time into what you do and put it in front of people and hear, oh, well, it doesn't do these 5 things that I really wanted it to do, therefore you suck. There's as of the recording of this podcast, there's been this thing, Keith Brownlee, like basically tanked a company because it was a little pin that goes on your lapel and it's like an AI assistant. And he goes, this is the worst product review I've ever done. Now,
Wow.
If you go back and look at what he did, he actually had positive things to say about the thing that he did. He just didn't think that it did exactly what the founder claimed that it did. And it's touched off this firestorm about, how can an influencer basically bankrupt a company? And I'm like, how could an influencer in good conscience tell somebody something that wasn't true? I mean, you always have to balance this out, right? Is what a person is telling me, is it their honest opinion or is it a subsidized opinion? And you have to unpack all of that too. But you also have to be realistic about what you're trying to accomplish. I was actually thinking about this. A few years ago, we had a great presentation when we were at Lightstep from Ben Siegelman, who used to be at Google. And he flat out said, like early on in the discussion, he goes, don't build tools like Google builds tools. And don't get mad at Google when the tool doesn't do what you think it should, because we build tools at Google to fix a problem that we at Google have. Like, you may not have to deal with, petabytes per second of data flowing back and forth between data centers. We do. And so when we built that tool, we used our methodology to use it. And then if we release it to the industry as an open source project and you get mad because it doesn't have a confirmation dialogue before you do a thing, we don't build tools like that. So you have to understand what you're trying to get into. My favorite thing is like, my dad always told me, don't use a screwdriver as a chisel unless you really have to. But don't be surprised if you break your screwdriver, because that's not what it's designed to do. And when I'm giving these reviews and they're like, oh, well, this is a wonderful, endpoint defense solution. I'm like, yeah, it's great if all you're ever going to do with it is endpoint defense. But if you try to use all these other features, you're going to run into problems. It's a classic case of a unified threat management firewall, right? If you're just using it as a packet filter, it works great. As soon as you start turning on all the functions, throughput through that box goes down fast because it's not designed to operate all of the tools turned on at once. Should the company have said that? Yeah. But the company isn't going to over provision the box to sell it to you to turn everything on at the price point you want to buy the box for.
Yeah, and I like the references to knowing what you need. I mean, every company's different in what they need out of the tools. It's tough as a product builder to try and hit the right use cases and have it work in the best number of cases so that everybody can take a bite of it, because that's ultimately the goal, is to have the widest range of customers possible. But every customer's got to take the time to understand what we really need this for, what we need it to do, how it's going to fit in with our existing processes. If it's a good enough tool, maybe we need to change our processes. And I know a lot of companies will look at a tool and say, if it doesn't fit our processes, then we have to pass on it. I always like to remind them that your processes aren't perfect. And if a tool can get into your environment and do the needful thing, and you have to change your processes because of it, that might not be the worst thing, because then you are attuning it to a product that you're planning on using it. Yeah, sure, it may mean that your processes have to change if you change your tool, but that's not the only cost of change in that situation anyway.
I can't tell you the number of times that people had a security policy in place that had like dumb things in it. And sometimes dumb things make sense, but other times you're just like, why do we do this? And if you can't reasonably justify that answer, and the tool breaks because your process management doesn't work, then you really have to understand, why are we doing this thing? I mean, some of them are real easy. Like I remember stories of like, I'm going to go log into my system and I'm going to go get a cup of coffee from the office coffee pot. And by the time I get back, it's all done. Why are we doing that? Well, as it turns out, it takes 5 minutes for these scripts to load and run all this stuff. So there's a good reason for it. But if the policy is, that all machine names have to start with an N or something like that, it's like, are we doing this because the guy who wrote the policy really likes words that start with the letter N? Or are we just doing this because that's what somebody observed and we're going to continue to do that over and over again? Like you have to have justifications, and you have to have somebody that's willing to step forward and ask why. Why is the policy like this? How could we make it better? That was actually one of the very first things I did in a professional capacity. Is I worked for IBM, and we would deploy new laptops to people. That was my job as an intern. And it took an hour to do this. And we're like, well, how could we do more deployments in a day? Well, we can't if it takes an hour to do every deployment. So we started looking at the process and going, well, why are we like, we do two things and we reboot, and we do two more things and we reboot. Well, why couldn't we do all four of those things and then reboot at the end of that? Because that saves a reboot. So that saves, like, this is 2001. So that saved like 4 minutes on a reboot. And they're like, well, we never really asked why. We just kind of kept putting things onto the end of it, and those things required a reboot. I'm like, well, if you can combine all of those things together, and we, obviously we were ISO certified, so we had to go prove that there was a time saving, and we had to show that it wasn't materially impacting the effect of what we were doing. But like, those are the simple questions. And too often people's answer to why is, well, that's just the way we've always done it.
Yeah. I would jump in on this because this is something that I work on a lot with companies, like as a compliance officer, where very often there's a lot of things that have been said, like IT will say or security will say, like, oh, well, compliance told us to do it this way, right? And very often, sometimes that comes because an auditor has specifically been like, I've seen this done well in a certain organization, or they've been like, if you fix it this way, then like you'll pass, which is ridiculous, and something I've gotten into some very serious arguments with ISO auditors on before, because I'm like, hey, whoa, just because this worked for XYZ company, you guys are now auditing us against somebody else's process as opposed to the standard, right? Like, let's focus on actually, like, do these laptops meet the endpoint protection requirements? That's really what they're here to audit. I've had some back and forth with auditors, right, where they're like, well, we've seen this done really well. And sometimes that can be hugely valuable for smaller companies that are being audited by external independent auditors, and like amazing if they will tell you who's doing it well, right? Like that's a huge learning opportunity for a company. But I have had some pretty big debates with auditors before where they're like, oh, well, like this is just how it's normally done. And it's like, but does that make sense for this company? I don't think you're empowered to say that. And again, where you have compliance requirements, of course, it's a rule. And that's really what a security control is, right? It's a rule for the company, and how the company implements that is ultimately the company's decision. And that doesn't mean just because it made sense 6 months ago that it makes sense now. And so those implementations need to be a little bit flexible to making sure those processes don't just stop making sense. Because I've absolutely seen the same thing that you're saying, Tom, where it's like, well, compliance said we do it this way. And then I'm pulled into the room and I'm like, no, like, this is just how we've been doing that. But that doesn't mean that it shouldn't be changing and growing with the company, because otherwise some of this stuff starts to slow people down and starts to slow innovation, which is where we really get a lot of friction between security and compliance.
Tom, I recently listened to one of the Tech Field Day podcast episodes where you talked about compliance potentially being more of a problem than a help. Elu, I was, of course, thinking about you through the whole thing, so I'll have to share that with you. But that's another whole topic we could have you back on for sure.
Yeah, Tom, I would love to bring it back to, I really love what you said about like with the influencer space of them being independent versus, what you said about like, what's the role of an influencer where they might bankrupt a company. And it's a risk, right? I think that's a risk for any company that's also willing to work with influencers. I think that's probably exists even way before the influencer space, right? Where we used to see, like art critics, might have like really like made or break, like could be a make or break article and stuff like that. That's not new. But I guess thinking through also the bias, just like I would love to just hear your perspective on that, because it is a little risky for companies to potentially to work with influencers because it could go poorly.
You're right. It absolutely can. And that's what I warn people all the time when they come to Tech Field Day is you will hear the truth. You may not hear what you want to hear. And we fall into this trap all the time, right? I want you to tell me that my baby is pretty. Please don't tell me my baby is ugly. In fact, Stephen Foskett, the founder of Field Day, and I, we actually kind of have this joke when people are like, so tell us what you really think about product X. And we're like, oh, you don't want to hear what I have to say about that. That's warning one. And if you persist, I will eventually tell you the truth, and you may not like to hear it. And listen, I know you put your heart and soul into this thing. You want it to succeed. I want you to succeed, but I also feel like I'm honor bound to tell you when you need to adjust things. When I'm not doing field day stuff, I'm heavily involved in scouting. And I do a leadership course all the time. And one of the key things that I've taken away from this leadership course over the years that I've been doing it is feedback is a gift. If someone is willing to tell you about something, listen to them. They're taking time out of their life to educate you. However, feedback is a gift when it's wrapped in a bow. People are much more willing to accept feedback about whatever it is if it looks pretty or it sounds pretty. You don't have to pull punches, but you don't have to be outright mean. Going back to your art critic thing, is the proper way to criticize this painting? Trying to understand what you're going for here versus this is crap and it doesn't look right to me. Well, they're both valuable feedback, but one of them is going to be taken in a lot better way than the other. And so influencers have to walk this line of, do I provide valuable feedback to help you get better? Or am I being, for lack of a better term, Simon Cowell on American Idol, who's making my name off of being the grumpy British guy? And you'll note that after American Idol, every show had to have a grumpy foreign accent person because for whatever reason, criticism sounds a lot more authoritative when it's not spoken in English, or at least with an American accent. So I'm wondering, like, if you go to Britain, is the grumpy person American? Like, I don't
Or like
know.
Australian or something.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I've never met a grumpy Australian. I wouldn't know. To me, it comes back to what is the end result of this? If I tell you the truth, if I tell you, you missed the market on this, or I don't understand how you're trying to accomplish this, is it going to make you better? If it does, then yes, I need to tell you that you need to fix this. But in some cases, like, you can just immediately get a sense like you're chasing the wrong market here. So am I going to like grind this discussion to a halt to try to prove a point to be right? Or am I just going to be like, that's an interesting take. I can't wait to see how this pans out for you.
Yeah, one of the things I loved about being a Tech Field Day delegate is that we as a group would always, it was a spoken rule amongst ourselves, but not necessarily publicly, is that if we think there's a deficiency with that product, we're going to try to drive them to tell us that there isn't that deficiency. Like, we want them to give us the positive spin on where we think things may be missing, and only call it out if it's something that is truly missing there. And in a way that says, hey, the customers that I have want it this way. Have you thought about doing it that way? Because it doesn't seem like you're doing it that way. And it's, it's that gentle guidance sometimes that can be so important, like you said, to help them understand that. But at the same time, tell everybody who's watching to say, it's missing this thing. And if you have to have this thing, this may not be the product for you, and to give them that opportunity. So that's really tough. As an influencer.
And another thing to remember, and this is for the influencers out there, or the pseudo influencers, depending on who's listening, you are not the center of the universe. You have a job that you do and you're very good at it, but there are other people who do things that are not you. I will tell you that working IT in healthcare is a lot different than working IT in finance or retail, and it's a lot different than working IT for a large cloud provider. Yes, you're working on computer systems in all of those avenues, but they're different. Like, regulatory compliance in healthcare is worlds different than working it in financial. Like simple things like, I might have a guest wireless network in the hospital because I want people to be able to get on my wireless network so that they can, surf the internet while the loved one's in the hospital. If you improperly configure a guest wireless network in finance, you can be fined millions of dollars, because if the guest network has any kind of accessibility to the internal PCI stuff, like, that's a ding on a PCI audit instantly. And like, people don't understand the pressure that you have to go through. Like, a downtime situation in a hospital means people could die. A downtime situation in financial markets means people could lose hundreds of thousands of dollars. Downtime at your local manufacturing facility means that work isn't processed. So like, failure modes have different things. And then, I was just talking about this morning, like, when Maersk's systems go offline, that affects millions of dollars of global commerce because they got infected with WannaCry. When a state-sponsored actor steals government secrets from an organization, that could potentially impact GDPs and lives of intelligence agents and all kinds of crazy things like that. They're both hacking incidents, but they have a different scope. And
Yeah.
you have to understand that as an influencer, you sometimes have to step out of your own shoes for a minute and be like, just because I don't see where this is coming from doesn't mean that it's wrong. Maybe I see things that could be taken that way. And so that's why a lot of times, as someone who has been forged in the fire of being the snarky analyst, sometimes I'll take a different approach. I won't tell them they're wrong. I'll ask me to tell them why they're right. So
Mhm.
I see that you've chosen to do it this way, and not a lot of people have chosen to do it that way. Could you help me understand why you're trying to approach it from this perspective? And then usually if they have a lucid argument that makes sense and doesn't necessarily trip any other alarm bells, then maybe as a person, I'll be like, okay, well, maybe I wasn't looking at this right. But if they try to sell me a line of BS and try to convince me with buzzwordy marketing stuff that I'm not looking at the problem correctly, then I usually figure it out. It's not me that has the problem. It's their perception of the market that is a problem.
Yeah. I love the like cohesivity there of where we started the episode then of like the what is the product, and then it's kind of turning into the maybe if you're not totally understanding exactly the use case, the then like really asking the company like the why and what is the thing they're trying to solve, because I do think what you just said too about context is so valuable and something that is very often like easy for us to forget when we're so focused on whatever world of technology and security and IT we're focused on, like specifically on the regulatory side. It is so different. And so figuring out the like, why is this important? So to the point that this whole company now exists to solve this problem and that they're asking for feedback, and making sure that if they're ready, are they also ready for the feedback? I think is another just like thing we could definitely keep talking about, but I think we're getting close on our time. So Tom, I do have a departing question, and we're really going to try to do this for all of our speakers, because it's something that I spend a lot of time thinking about, specifically like in my space, where I had a CTO recently say, hey, the fight for privacy is dead, and now it's the fight for security. And I would love to just get, again, there's no right or wrong answers. I would just love to hear your feedback on that. Do you think it's the fight for privacy? Is it still alive, or is it now the fight for security?
It's a tough answer, and I'll tell you why. Go ask any 15-year-old kid what privacy looks like. I promise you their answer is going to be radically different than what you or even your parents would say. Like, how many times have you heard about an older person? Well, they're very private. Like they don't give that information out. But yet those are the same people that get wrapped up in these filter bubbles because they keep liking things on Facebook or other social media platforms, not understanding that that is invading their privacy, right? Whereas a younger person, Gen Z or Gen Alpha, has a very different perspective on what privacy versus security is. They know their information's out there. They're doing what they can to protect that information from being shared in places that it shouldn't be. Like someone brought up a fact the other day. In the US, a social security number is actually in a lot of places. It's not bad that an SSN is out there. What's bad is that the number of companies that associate your social security number with so much other PII that you can't, they're inextricably linked. That's where the problems start happening. So I think that privacy is always going to be very conditional. Like, obviously, there's certain things that I don't necessarily want people to have, but it's up to me to provide as much security of that as possible. So, like, for example, I don't like people emailing me bank account information in clear text. I would rather log into a portal. Or something as simple as when I answer the phone and people are like, can you confirm this information for me? No, I will not confirm this on a telephone call. It is your responsibility to send me information that I authenticate back to you. I'm not reading out that information on clear text because I've just given you something that you didn't already have. Like, you need to prove it to me. And that, but that's a shift in mentality, right? Like, it used to be, you can't know anything about me. Like you can't know my last name. You can't know my mother's maiden name, all that other stuff. I can find that. Like, that's easy to come across now. What I need to do is I need to create more challenges in my organization to prevent people from doing that. So, like, here's a good example. Something like business email compromise has become a huge security hole, right? Like, how many times have we heard the joke of, why is the CEO emailing me asking me to send him $1,000 in Apple gift cards to pay off this contractor? Like, as someone who's security savvy, there are so many things along that line that immediately triggered like problems. Like, we don't pay contractors in Apple gift cards. We don't send those card numbers out over clear text anyway. Like, why is the CEO emailing me this instead of coming down to ask me those questions? You've got to create that challenge and response method. And even if it's something as simple as, well, cool, can you give me the passphrase of the day? Well, we don't have a passphrase of the day. Yes, but if that person responds with an attempt at the passphrase of the day, or says, oh, well, we don't need a passphrase of the day for this particular transaction, now you've already got a problem. You've created a pseudo two-factor authentication for an in-person exchange. And like, that's how I treat things all the time when people call me, even if they're my loved ones. I'm like, okay, we need to have some kind of other out-of-band communication. So like, I'll text them and I'll be like, are you calling me? Like, what's going on? So that when they get back to me, they're like, well, no, I'm not talking to you. I'm like, ha, 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 ha. Now we've got this thing going on. So that adds a layer of security on top of information that I thought should have been private, but maybe necessarily wasn't.
I love it. So I think you have kind of both. I think there is still part of you that still thinks there is still a fight for privacy, but you're also taking on additional responsibility for your personal security, which I absolutely love.
The optimist in me wants to say yes, but the cynic in me knows reality is different.
I was going to say, it sounds like the relationship status it's complicated.
Exactly.
Cool, Tom. Well, we really appreciate you having the time with us and sharing these thoughts. I think it'll be very valuable to our listeners. I know it was to me. So any parting thoughts over everything we talked about? Any kind of final things you want everyone to take away?
I will say that security becomes a whole lot easier when communication is clear, both with other people, but also with yourself. Define your needs. Be honest in your investigations. Ask the right questions, even if they feel pointed sometimes, because clear answers are better than nebulous, sure, it'll do whatever you want it to do as long as you sign the PO. You're going to have to put in the work ahead of time. And I will also, kind of speaking to some of the last points that we said, I will bring up something that investors will always tell me. If a company tells you that they are only company in a market that does X, they either are in the wrong market, or they have truly found something revolutionary, in which case, why aren't you making more money off of this right now? So Be cynical to the point of satisfying your curiosity, and you'll never be disappointed.
So to take your advice to be cynical, I want to point out the fact when you say clear communications, you don't mean clear text communications, right?
No. Clear communications over encrypted communications channels.
Absolutely. Cool. Well, let everybody know how they can contact you if they want to further these conversations.
Well, the easiest way to contact me, I'm on social media almost everywhere as Networking Nerd. If you want to see what I do for my Bruce Wayne job, you can go over to techfieldday.com, which is the event series that I do. But if you want to check out my Batman job, my blog is networkingnerd.net, where I somewhat frequently write about security challenges and privacy issues, and then occasionally I'll review hardware or something. So it's my own little corner of the internet where I get to say what I want sometimes, and hopefully people still listen.
Great. Well, again, really appreciate you being on, and we really appreciate all the listeners that showed up for this conversation. And if you want to continue the conversation, we're Socializing Security on LinkedIn particularly, or info at Socializing Security. So
thanks, Tom. We did it. We recorded our first speaker session, which I'm really excited about. I think that was awesome. And I'm so grateful that Tom joined us and had such a phenomenal insights.
Yeah, I love Tom. He's a great guy, and he's great at being on a podcast like this, where he gets to soliloquy himself, where he can't always do that on his own podcast. So I knew he'd be able to roll with whatever we threw at him. His experience is top notch, as having been a customer and being in this space where he evaluates a lot of vendors and talks to a lot of influencers. So that was a fantastic conversation for sure.
Yeah, I think for me, some of the things that I'm taking away of some of the things that while we were, again, listening together and listening with Tom as he was chatting with us and shining a light on some of the things we talked about on the episode, I loved those follow-up questions for when you're vetting a company, whether that's a security vendor or IT, compliance, GRC, like whatever it is. Honestly, it could just be like who you're buying your next product from for your home, whatever, but really distilling that down to what is the product. And if it's not super clear of like, why is this meaningful to me? Like as a consumer, whether that's B2B or B2C, whatever, like your role is at the time of understanding really like what this thing is and why it's important are some things I'm going to continue to think about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it's just like anything else, like you said, any project that you buy, you should know what you need that tool to do and make sure the tool can do it. And in IT, a lot of that decision making really comes down to understanding not only the technical aspects of can it do it, how well does it do it, but how well is it supported, and what are the use cases they built it for. And I've run into that a lot being on the vendor side, where we have to define those really specific use cases so that we know if we're even approaching the right customers or not. And a good vendor will be like, we're not the right fit for you based on everything that you've told me. So things like Tech Field Day and listening to influencers is great because they know the technical aspects and they can dig into them to make sure that they're valid, but also talk about the use cases and try to pull out of the vendors which use cases are the right ones.
Oh yeah, I think even for IT organizations within companies of adding Tech Field Day as one of the like sources of truth of being like, hey, has this vendor like had an experience like, being vetted by influencers, and whether that's on Tech Field Day or elsewhere, there are creative ways to be looking into companies that aren't just looking at their website these days. There are so many reviews that exist, and there are actually spaces for consumers to share their feedback. So coming up, I think Tech Field Day is a great resource for that. And also just, looking on social media, even like LinkedIn, has anybody like posted some of the testimonial stuff like that? You can actually talk to companies that are using the technology. That's like a pretty common ask to like ask for a referral and actually then follow through and talk to the company that's using the tool and ask them like, hey, like what's working really well? And maybe what are the things that are challenging? And usually if it's a private conversation, they might actually give you more information than you think.
Yeah. Most vendors of any decent size have I don't want to say a bench, but they've got a list of customers that are promoters. I mean, let's be honest, they're not going to send a prospect to go talk to somebody that has had a bad experience. But you can hear from somebody in the real world. And generally if you're one-on-one with that other company, they'll be honest. And if you ask them, hey, we've got this specific situation, have you tried to use the product this way? If so, how well did it work? Tell me about your worst support incident that you had to deal with and how did they handle it? Those types of questions are very valid. You'll generally get good answers, but again, they're going to be vetted by people who have been selected to have that conversation with you. So
as long as you recognize the bias, right? Like, I think we talked about it in the episode as well with honest versus like subsidized reviews and like sponsored posts with influencers. It's the same concept when you're talking to like what I've heard as like a raving fan or like a company referral, right? Of thinking through like, okay, that's great. But I think what is powerful about asking them, how are you using this? Like, what problem does this tool or platform solve for your organization? And maybe that will help kind of distill that down. And I think that was what I got out of Tom's conversation of learning really not only like what it is, but also like, why are you using this and why do you love it so much? What is the problem that the consumer or the customer was trying to solve by outsourcing this particular thing and using this tool, whether it's a security tool, hardware, whatever we want to say that it is. I think that's a really useful takeaway for anyone.
Yeah, 100%. Been there and would give very similar advice. So I was really glad that you picked that out of everything that Tom said, because that's something I would definitely underline for everybody.
Yeah, and then it sounds like I'm going to have to talk to Tom about the difference between compliance and security professionals, because I think he and I could probably have a whole other episode of just talking about that and the different perspectives, because I flirt that line between both and can appreciate what he was concerned about with some of those things. But sometimes, yeah, rules are rules, and sometimes that doesn't mean that they make sense just because we set it up one way. I thought that was also a really great takeaway.
Yep, Yep. And I'll have to share that episode with you, and we'll put this episode in the show notes as well, about how compliance fits in, and when compliance becomes more of a burden than a help. But, spoiler alert, they kind of came to the conclusion that, especially if you have, compliance around your own internal processes, so those kind of ISO type of audits, are you doing what you said you were going to do? They're actually a good thing. And, they can be burdensome, but if you do them in the right way, then they can be helpful to make sure that you're staying on the right track. So
I think that's a new episode idea for us. So I think we'll have to note that one down too, of thinking around as somebody who sits in audits a lot and is defending companies very often and their process, of thinking through what does that look like. So another great episode. Our first speaker. Thank you so much to Tom. We really appreciate it. What an awesome interview.
Yep, totally. And again, thank you to the listeners, and let's continue to socialize these topics, offline, online, off the air, if you will.
Yeah, I think I just so enjoyed listening to Tom as we were learning together. So thanks so much.
Take care. Thank you for joining us for another episode of Socializing Security. We hope you learned a thing or two with us.
If you'd like to continue socializing with us on this topic or have feedback, we'd love to hear from you on LinkedIn or social media. Just search for Socializing Security. Or you can email us at info@socializingsecurity.com.
Until next time, stay social and stay secure.